Oh, it's huge.
Yeah.
You see, we're right, and we kind of that's correct. We're sending fresh water with the lakes to the east, to the north, Mississippi to the west, aquifers to the west, and they've sucked that down.
80 hours a week is a lot.
Yeah. Sometimes it's not. My name is Mike Ewald. I'm the founder and director of Energy Justice Network. We're a national group based in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. I live in DC, and we help groups throughout the country fight off dirty energy and waste facilities of various sorts, from incinerators and landfills to power plants, ethanol refineries, and you name it. Anything that has a smokestack or is otherwise toxic or dangerous for our community. We're a grassroots network that helps folks fight these things off and get the information that they need. So we're going to walk through some of the technologies and policies that are false solutions to climate change. And there's about 8 workshops worth of material in here, so I'm just going to give you some of the top level highlights and hope that you'll come up with questions and drill down deeper in question and answer. So as an overview, and you're welcome to turn around and be able to look at it. So in the 2 categories, we got different policies that are posing as solutions to climate change and all sorts of technologies that have marketed themselves. Pretty much every dirty energy technology has marketed itself as a solution to climate change, even coal, which they like to pretend is green. So I'm going to walk you through some of these. Now, Rachel's going to get into a little more detail on it, on some of them, so I won't get into the policies in too much depth. But cap and trade is the main one that has been put forth in Congress. It's the one that Obama's been talking about recently in his climate address, is the mechanism that they will use. And basically what cap and trade means is that they will put a cap on how much greenhouse gas pollution is allowed to be put out. And then they basically give out permits or auction off the right to pollute the atmosphere a certain amount to polluters that already do so, and then let them trade that among themselves. And there are a lot of problems with that approach. This here is just walking through like some of the different categories of types of climate policies, and I would consider this in the worst category. Usually what they were talking about is giving away the right to pollute to polluters that are already doing so, although some have pushed for a better version, which I still think is awful, where they auction off the right to pollute. In some cases, we have environmental groups that are considered on the leftier side still pushing things that are problematic, but they use a dividend approach, where they basically put a cap on how much pollution can come out, and that increased cost to consumers for energy, they would give a rebate check to people to make up for that. The Citizens Climate Lobby, which we've been pushing back against recently, I'll expel that a little bit more soon, has been pushing a carbon tax. They like to call it a fee, as if it's going to confuse people that it's not a tax when it is. And so they want to put this tax on and then give people dividend checks to make up for the increased cost with that approach. And that's been problematic in part because the leading bill, the Boxer-Sanders bill pushing this right now, will give the dividend checks each month just to legal US residents, which means we're going to have about 11 million undocumented people having their energy costs raised and not getting a compensation check and worsening the inequality there. And that's just one of multiple problems with that approach. So we've been pushing a mandated shift to clean solutions, and I'll outline that in a bit. But first, on cap and trade. The main problems with cap and trade are that, first of all, the caps got set too high. We saw this in the European Union, where they set up a cap and trade system there, and they artificially inflate the amount of pollution that's coming out in order to create a market that polluters could be happy with. And so the caps will be set so high that they really is not having the effect that's supposed to. They're also privatizing the atmosphere when they do this, so the whole idea of giving a right to pollute, which already is indoctrinated in a lot of permits that are given out to polluters, this kind of furthers that concept and is a problem fundamentally. It's also highly subject to fraud and abuse. We have examples like, I think in India there was a factory where they said, we want to expand this much, and well, now we're going to only expand this much, so that's a reduction. Well, wait, they're increasing their emissions. They're just not increasing them as much as they planned to, and so now they're going to get credit for emissions reductions. So you see things like that and a lot of things that are just really hard to measure because they're talking about stuff that might happen in the future. and trying to make offsets and tradable commodities based on things that are not readily measurable. There's also the problem that the distribution of this happens to burden low-income and minority communities more. If you have communities like the community in Richmond, California with a big oil refinery there that Chevron runs, buying credits from some forest offset in Michigan or from some polluter that shut down, maybe they have to shut down anyway, but they get to sell credits to keep someone else's pollution going, and then that community of color in Richmond keeps getting polluted because it's the wealthier communities that are generally going to have facilities shutting down, and the communities of color and low-income communities that are going to end up with companies buying credits. They also create large loopholes for polluters, and if you look at who's behind a lot of these, like the bills that have been pushed, Wall Street is very involved because they don't trade in these commodities. Some of the foundations giving to environmental groups, like the Joyce Foundation, that has given groups like NRDC and the Clean Air Task Force funding to promote clean coal. And they've actually testified in favor of coal gasification plants that our members have been fighting. And they do this because they were running, until it collapsed, the Chicago Climate Exchange, and they want to sell credits from things like clean coal plants that sequester their emissions underground and hope that they somehow don't leak out. So there are a lot of quotes from folks big in the field that just show that the trading schemes aren't working. These are just a couple of them from folks in the Citigroup. You know, this is like Wall Street leaders saying that it's really not going to do anything to curb emissions, but we're going to make a bunch of money off of it. So, so they're going to have a lot of winners, but consumers will be the losers. Just like Deutsche Bank, you know, all these top folks, I don't want to go through and read them all to you, but the folks in power, the folks that really know what's up with the economy, realize that this is a joke. So just energy consultant saying things, let's see, what we succeed. Yeah, it's just showing what is unfolded in Europe in terms of the permits not being adequate. This is a gentleman who's from the Richmond, California community, talking about how it's environmental racism to be doing this kind of cap and trade systems. They've spoken out against that a lot. And this is one of my favorite quotes. When they talk about carbon offsets, the fact that it's not an apple, it's not something measurable that you can weigh and say, we're going to pay you so much for this, but they're an imaginary commodity created by deducting what you hope happens from what you guess would have happened. So you can imagine that there are a lot of consultants that come up with different metrics to measure things that are in the future that may or may not unfold a certain way, and then they're trying to trade on something that is this intangible.
Could you hold that because I'm writing that?
I can make these available later too. I'll pass the sign sheet around shortly, and if you put your wonderful stuff down, I'll get it too. So on carbon taxes, recently the Citizens Climate Lobby, which is, I don't know how they're funded, but they have brought a bunch of people together across the country for a conference in DC recently, and I crashed the conference. And I put together an open letter to the Citizens Climate Lobby, which I have some copies of. I'll pass it along soon. Or actually, I'll leave them up here, so I don't have enough for everyone, but you can take one on the way out if you want one. And we complained about how not only is the legislation that they're about to lobby for racist in the whole issue of who gets the dividend checks that I mentioned earlier, but it's not adequate. It doesn't guarantee specific reductions in a specific time frame, so it's relying on market-based approaches to know what's best. And in doing so, it punishes just part of what is the problem. So you have your spectrum of dirty energy technologies. You got your nuclear, you got your biofuels and biomass and waste incineration, and then you got your fossil fuels. And so if we're going to punish just the fossil fuels in that, you're putting the rest of the competitive advantage. And some of those bills not only put nuclear at competitive advantage, and there are a lot of reports showing that a carbon tax would make nuclear a lot more competitive, but some of them implicitly and explicitly promote biomass incineration, which we know is worse than coal for the climate. And yet they're going to shift money into that deliberately as if it's a clean solution. So what we think are the solutions would be a mandated shift to what we know needs to happen. Let's not rely on the market to know what's best. We've seen how that has turned out for the most part. So we need to say, this is what we hope will happen. Let's make sure that happens and just mandate it and not hope that the market is going to do it for us. So basically have, first of all, something that sets a conservation efficiency mandate. It says we're going to reduce our energy demand through all three sectors, transportation, electricity, and heating, by 75%. And that is necessary. Actually, it needs to be about 80% just to become global parity, because the US uses so darn much more than the rest of the world. So we need to cut at least half and then half again. And then meet the rest with wind, solar, and energy storage. There's plenty of those things to go around. Rachel might contradict me on that, but we'll see. But I think if we reduce our demand enough, then we can meet our energy needs easily with things that don't burn anything, don't use nuclear or other problematic technologies. We also have a huge amount of energy subsidies that is going to maintain the system that is currently in place. So we need to shift that $74 billion a year in annual dirty energy subsidies over to clean stuff to make this shift happen. We need a national zero waste policy because a lot of our emissions are related to materials and goods and food and the other things that are produced. And so if we stop trashing them and landfilling and incinerating these things and actually put them back into the economy so that we can not have to extract more materials, that saves a lot of energy and a lot of emissions.
I know I came late, but I want to ask, do you have these written on? Are these available?
I'll pass the science sheet around and you can get a copy of this.
Thank you.
It's also in a fact sheet I'll pass around. And sustainable agriculture, we need to really localize our food supply and do all the different things in terms of agriculture to make sure that we don't have all the greenhouse gas emissions from that. And that includes getting people to eat lower on the food chain. I know this is anathema for a lot of people to say who aren't already vegetarian or vegan, but really where we're going, we need to have, 10 minutes? Okay, great. So we need to get to the point where more people are eating vegan diets because we don't have the land, the water, the resources, the energy for people to eat like they do in this country. And basically the way I pitch it to people is if you don't like that answer, just wait until it becomes too expensive to buy meat and dairy, because that will happen.
Are you recommending any kind of taxing or pricing on water to start to get towards an honest appreciation of what the water embodiment?
I haven't thought through that.
I
haven't thought through that side of it, but I think if we remove the subsidies that we see, not just in water, but corn and other farm bill subsidies.
It's not a subsidy, it's just not priced. The only price is the cost of the straw to put in the ground.
Right, well, let's jump into question and answers later, because I have a lot of go try to get through in my 10 minutes I have left.
Okay.
But that's a good point, and we should definitely work that into the solutions. So the reason I put zero, I say finally zero, public campaign financing, is because we're not going to make any of this stuff possible until we address the root of the problem and get corporate control out of our government. And so that's why that is the baseline to get anything done. So I'd like to shock people, even though we actually created the No New Coal Plants Network in 2006, that network, the grassroots resistance to new coal plants in this country. So even though Sierra Club had all their natural gas industry money to fight the coal industry and gets all the credit for all these coal victories, it was the grassroots network that we created before they were willing to jump into the issue that actually got a lot of that work done. And so as much as we're against coal and have led that work on that, there are a lot of things that are actually worse than coal. And this is tough for some folks find coal to want to hear, but it's true. So with nuclear power, first of all, a single plant can make large areas of the Earth uninhabitable, as Fukushima has showed us recently. And that's a whole other workshop, I won't get into that, but it's a great, important topic. It's also so expensive. It's the most subsidized form of energy that we've had. Think of us, no over 50% of all the subsidies for, all the R&D alone, rather, in about a 60-year period, up to 2007, went to nuclear alone for all the energy technology. So it sucks up all the resources economically we need to do a transition. It can't replace fossil fuels in a meaningful time frame. It can't do it affordably. It basically prevents us from getting to the transitions we need. Natural gas, we're finding out, is also worse than coal for greenhouse gases, because methane is not 21 times worse than coal or is worse than CO2. It's actually 105 times worse than CO2 if you look at it over a 20-year time frame with the latest science that NASA put out, which is all the way 4 years old already, from 2009. So if we actually look at it that way and look at how much methane is leaking out of the system, natural gas is actually doing more damage, even though it's posed as an alternative that's cleaner. And by other measures, it's cleaner, just not on greenhouse gases. Landfill gas is another huge one, and a lot of people think it's there anyway, you might as well burn it for energy, which is actually really untrue. If you burn for energy, you end up mismanaging the landfill in ways that causes more gas to escape. And since a lot of that gas is methane, there's a lot of CO2 in there too, it's about half of each. The capture rates are already really low, but you lower the capture rates even more when you mismanage it to crank up the methane concentration to burn for energy. So it's actually better to waste the gas by flaring it than to burn for energy, the way they manipulate the landfills when they do this. That's a whole other complicated thing. I've got a fact sheet on my table, so I won't get into that right now. But also it has mercury emissions. There are a lot of toxins in landfill gas, and one of the things in there is methyl mercury. And so you pollute the community more with this, and the levels of mercury pollution are actually comparable if you just look at what's coming out of the burner at the landfill to a smokestack from a coal power plant. If you look at the rest of the landfill, what's not being captured or leaking out is far worse.
Mike, you're not including waste to energy, which is expansive.
There is no such thing as waste to energy. It's a waste of energy, and you can't turn waste into energy without a nuclear reaction. Matter into energy is not what's happening. You turn trash into toxic ash and toxic air emissions. So that's trash incineration you're talking about. That's the next point. And I have a few slides on that I'll get into. Greenhouse gases from trash incineration are actually 2.5 times worse than coal. And all of the other emissions are worse than coal. I'll show you the details in another slide soon. Biomass incineration, similarly, a lot of pollutants are comparable to coal depending on which ones you're looking at and what type of biomass you mean. But the greenhouse gas emissions are consistently about 50% worse than coal.
Regarding that, two things. One, that's the first time I've heard that. And second, the best fertilizer on earth is ash. So if you're burning that, if you actually
I'm going to disagree with you on that.
Retrieved
Let's talk about biochar later if that's what you're getting at, because biochar is a false solution as well. It's pyrolysis, which is a type of incineration. It's incredibly toxic, and it's not really a solution to climate change. And Rachel is like the expert on it. Yes, it is. All pyrolysis is a type of incineration. It creates polycyclic aromatic hydrocarbons and other toxic pollutants that cause cancer. So we do not support that at all. Transition fuels, all these things tend to get described as transition fuels. And I don't believe there is such a thing as transition, because transitions are things that get you from A to C by going through B. The only example I know of that might fit this is conversion of cars from internal combustion engines to hybrid cars to electric cars. You can even convert the same car through those 3 steps. And so that is a genuine transition that I'll accept as that. Anything else, I would say no, the transition argument does not apply, because what's happening, first of all, you're implying that we need to wait to get to the real solutions, when that's not the case. The real solutions are here already. We can start implementing them now, so we don't need to wait for them. Oh, does that mean I'm out of time?
Well,
Oh.
just got the
Okay, I thought the 10 minute happened in 10 minutes, not. Okay. Ouch. Okay. So I'm going to go over. I'm sorry. So we must invest direct in the real solutions. It's an investment dead end to put money into something that takes 30 years to pay off, and it creates a barrier to transition because the economic entities involved in doing that so-called transition fuel are going to then lobby against replacing those technologies with the things that you're hoping they'll lead you to. So natural gas pipelines are not going to shut down and say, okay, let's build a windmill here. It just doesn't work that way. So I'm not going to go into all the details on why nuclear and other things are bad because I don't have time, but ask me about them later. Let's get through some nuclear stuff. I want to jump to the incinerator ones because they're less known. So these are all the different things that have been called biomass in different policies. All of them are dangerous and polluting. We're opposed to all of them with qualifications on the 2 at the bottom, which are gas-based, which can be dealt with responsibly in certain ways, but should never be considered renewable energy or subsidized as such. Just jump forward to it. So incineration, this is on trash incineration now. It's more expensive than landfilling. It's the most expensive way to manage waste. It's also the most expensive way to make energy. This is from the Department of Energy's Energy Information Administration data from 2010, showing that whether you're looking at the cost to build it or the cost to operate and maintain it is by far the most expensive. Nuclear is, I usually say, is the most expensive, but this is not accounting for all the subsidies going in. So if you count for all the nuclear subsidies, that would surely be most expensive of all of them. That's the whole question, so then if we can. This is the latest EPA data on emissions from different sources. So one of you commented you haven't heard this before. Well, this is the latest data from 2012, which is actually 2009 data on all the electric generators in the country. And you can see that trash incineration CO2 emissions are 2.5 times worse than coal. Biomass are 50% worse than coal. And those purple areas are the biogenic part. And they like to argue that there's this carbon neutrality idea and that biogenic carbon doesn't matter even though CO2 molecule is in the atmosphere. doesn't matter where it came from, it's going to cook the atmosphere just as much. And a federal court recently affirmed this just a few weeks ago when they said that they can't count this purple part, this biogenic emissions, as zero. They have to look at it, and they can't give exemptions like EPA was doing to the biomass industry. But studies have shown that the trees that grow to, supposedly they're just growing to suck up this carbon that was pulled back, that was put into the atmosphere. Biomass incinerators, it takes 40 years for the extra 50% pulse of CO2 coming out of a wood burner to become only as bad as coal. We don't have 40 years to wait for it to become as bad as coal and then hundreds of years to become carbon neutral. And that's if you plant trees just for that purpose and never cut them back down again, which is not what's happening. These are just some of the comparisons. This is a more visual version of it, of how much trash incineration compares to coal on other pollutants, so dioxins, mercury, all these different pollutants. Every one that's got comparable enough data to compare, they're far worse than coal power plants per unit of energy they create. I'm not going to go into all these, but I hope you'll ask me about them. One thing about hydro real quick, it does release greenhouse gases as well when they build new hydro dams because they flood out enough vegetation that methane is generated by those decomposing. So when they're building new dams, you have that and many other problems as well, including mercury emissions from methyl mercury.
What does it mean, not much potential?
There's not a lot of potential to build new dams. In the U.S., we've dammed off most of the places we can dam. No one's trying to build new ones because they're just too expensive anyway, so there's not a lot of ability to use more of it. So let me just leave it there. And is this Rachel?
Yeah.
So that question, why don't you ask me while we're getting this set up?
In Minneapolis, we have a trash incinerator that the city pushes quite hard, and they're looking to expand it right now. And one of their major claims is that by burning it, they don't have to bury it. And that's kind of the reason they're pushing trash incineration so hard.
So that's actually misleading. All incinerators require landfills for their toxic ash, and the toxic ash is actually worse in the landfill than the larger volume of unburned trash because you have a lot more toxic things in there, like dioxins that weren't there in the first place that can leach out. And it's just, what we really need to do is move to all the zero waste solutions that can reduce the waste stream cheaper, create 10 times more jobs, and not put toxic pollution into the air and the water like incineration does. But definitely that's talk. I didn't realize that they were trying to expand that one. We should work together on that. So let me get these sign-up sheets passed around for those who want to get in our information loop.
And I'll just jump right in because we are running a little bit late. We want to have plenty of time for discussion. I'm Rachel Smoker. I'm the co-director of Biofuel Watch, which is an organization that works internationally and nationally in the US and in the UK in particular. Louder? Yep. I guess in some ways I sort of think Energy Justice Network does a lot of the meat and potatoes, and Biofuel Watch looks at sort of the far edges of some of these technologies that are being proposed as solutions to climates, and we try and sort of raise awareness about them before they become really widespread. What I want to talk about today is, I think many of you probably listened to President Obama's speech about climate a few weeks ago, and maybe are members of Sierra Club or Greenpeace or any of the fairly big environmental groups in the United States. And we keep hearing that repeated over and over and over again that what we need is more renewable energy. We need green jobs, which will be provided by building this renewable energy infrastructure. And if we can just convert away from fossil fuels and to renewables, everything will be good. And this is the main heart of the climate policies for many of these big organizations and for our administration and so on. So what I want to do is challenge that. And much as I almost hate to do that, because I've spent a lot of years talking about certain false solutions like bioenergy, and people always say, so what are you for? And they want to say solar and wind and this and that, and there's some other good things. And there are good things. There are real solutions, as Mike has just gone over. There are real solutions which are common sense. The question is, how much should we be relying and believing in this myth about how renewable energy is going to fulfill fulfill its promise. And I invite you to check out a book which was very eye-opening to me. I sort of knew this was a problem, but this book really pulls things together. This is Green Illusions by Ozzie Zehner, and its subtitle is The Dirty Secrets of Clean Energy and the Future of Environmentalism. And he goes also into the problem of environmental groups continuing to, propagate this myth that renewable energy is the heart of our climate policy and will resolve the problems. So this figure right here is from the International Energy Administration, or agency, whatever it is, and it shows electricity generation and what types of fuels in the United States up to 2009, and it just, extends a little bit. And this is coal, this is oil, this is natural gas, nuclear. Up here we start to get into things that are called renewables. This purple bar here is hydro. This little tiny bit way up here is all renewable energy generation. Right? And if you were looking at transportation fuels, you'd also see a similar map. Biofuels, just a tiny little thread of a line at the very top of all of our energy production that's filled by renewable energy. And up here, I just also want to point out to you, biofuels and waste are that pale green bar, making up a very big part of the renewable energy generation. This other part is geothermal, solar, and wind all combined. That little tiny thin darker green bar, which is basically invisible, and you start to see it a little bit there and then dropping off. This is, by the way, when we reach the economic crisis, the one thing that's actually caused a reduction in energy consumption. And the other point about this, I'd like to go on to the next slide, but I won't bother you with it. It's just an expanded version of this that shows you this, sure, would you? Thanks. It just shows the breakout of this little smidgen here. Here it is. So here we have waste incineration, which Mike has just talked about, geothermal, solar, wind. Wind has actually gotten pretty big and is growing. Industrial combined heat and power and other forms of biomass are all of these. And the IEA predicts that biomass incineration is going to be growing as fast as wind and actually taking over, growing even faster than wind energy as the main renewable in the future. The reason being that a lot of the sites for wind have already been taken up. It's hard to site big, massive wind turbines, and people resist them. So what people don't realize when we talk about renewable energy is that mostly what we're talking about is expanding bioenergy. And the land footprint of bioenergy is so massive, the water footprint of bioenergy is so massive, that we need to really grapple with this fact and not just be saying, yeah, more renewable energy, yay. There are also other problems with these various different forms of renewable energy, which Ozzie Zehner goes into in great detail. I won't spend a lot of time with it. But what we don't realize is that solar panels are very, very expensive. It's very polluting. It takes a lot of materials to produce them. There's emissions of hexafluoroethane, nitrogen trifluoride, and sulfur hexafluoride. Big words, but anyway, very toxic chemicals that come from the facilities that manufacture solar panels. There's also the problem that they don't last forever, and they break down. We have a huge amount of e-waste to deal with, just as we do with computers and electronics and so on. What do you do with a solar panel? Throw it in the landfill when it's done? Because they do die out. They also they provide an intermittent source of power. When the sun's shining, that's great. But the sun doesn't always shine, as we know. The panels aren't aligned, it's dusty, et cetera. Those things all reduce the capacity of output from solar panels. The other thing about them is that, and so in many cases, when there's a lot of solar or renewables on the grid, you have to burn coal as a backup to keep the steady plane, because the sun shines, the wind blows, and you need steady energy. You burn coal as a backup to keep the base load electricity. That's also another reason why bioenergy has been so popular, in particular burning trees for electricity, because if you burn it, you can basically even substitute it in a coal plant. You can just retrofit a coal plant and do a conversion of a coal plant to burn at least partially biomass, if not fully. So, there's a story about solar panels that I always struck me, which is that, this farmer in China who was evicted from his land, and a big solar panel facility was constructed there, which now he's no longer got a place to live and grow his vegetables to feed his family. The land has got this huge facility on it that's dumping pollution into the waterways and so on in the area. The solar panels are being shipped to the United States and installed on very wealthy people's houses. by black people, poor black people in the United States. So that's the sort of encapsulating vision. And I live in Vermont. I can tell you there are a lot of wealthy, well-intended people putting solar panels up on the roof and feeling very powerful about that and very good about that. But there are a lot of problems with it. Wind, again, has this problem of being intermittent, requires some kind of backup. There's a lot of resistance to large turbines. People find them to be very disturbing to live next to, and they're, in Vermont we have a lot of ridge lines that people actually value and don't want these wind turbines there. It's nice that wind and solar don't require constant inputs of fuel, as is true for coal, as is true for bioenergy, and as is true for other forms of energy. However, the construction and the infrastructure needed to scale up those wind and solar are massive. Consider the concrete production needed to make platforms for those massive wind turbines alone. Concrete is one of the most energy-intensive industries that we have. So bioenergy is, as I said, one of the major players in all of the scale of renewables, far more so than people realize. We've seen in the last years the impact of biofuels on hunger globally, for example. According to ActionAid, the demand for crops to use for biofuel production just in the EU, and the EU is always a good example because they've taken on commitments to reduce their emissions, and while we haven't, they have, and so we can look to them and see what that looks like. What does that look like? Well, they have huge mandates in place for renewable energy, including bioenergy and biofuels. The impact of EU crop imports for biofuels in wheat and maize, just for wheat and maize, they actually burn and convert wheat and corn into energy for cars instead of people. It could have fed 127 million people for an entire year instead of the year's supply of fuels that were made from that. In the United States, we are now converting about 40% of our corn crop into ethanol. And the impact of that on the price of corn and the expanding land use and domino effect throughout the entire global agricultural system is driving more and more people into chronic hunger. The other side of that is that it's also driving speculative investment. So we are seeing ever more financial investment in land. In fact, by most analyses, probably about half of the land grabs that we've seen in the last 10 years or so have been with the intent of growing biofuel crops to satisfy this huge new, potentially profitable demand. And this is particularly the case in Africa, where over 19 million hectares of land have been purchased with the intent of growing bioenergy crops for export markets. And that's an area that's about 1.5 times the size of England. So the scale, the unbelievable scale, and this is satisfying a tiny smidgen of demand for transportation fuels, is an area the size of England being grabbed out from under the people who live there. And so this has become a huge problem that's getting a lot more visibility now, the issue of land grabs. It's also got huge impacts on biodiversity and how we do agriculture. In the US, the Conservation Reserve Program was actually a fairly effective way of maintaining some biodiversity in places like Iowa and where the corn crops are growing. That has, a lot of people have taken their land out and are growing corn. It's very profitable to do that. So all this demand for bioenergy is driving also the expansion, the burning of trees, for example, for electricity is pushing the development of genetically engineered trees that will grow faster and produce more wood more rapidly, that we can harvest them more sooner. And it's also pushing technologies like synthetic biology, which is a new field similar to genetic engineering, but people call it genetic engineering on steroids, where you basically take a microbe, it's mostly microbes, and you take its genetic information out and you make your own genetic lineage for that thing and stick it back into the shell, and you have a completely novel organism enzyme that will produce enzymes that can digest the cellulose in wood and other materials. And the question is, what happens when these microbes get released out into the into the environment, as we know is very likely to happen. A rogue microbe that digests cellulose could be problematic if it's just wandering around the globe. So I want to go on and talk a little bit about. Some of the sort of fringes of this. We've been watching for some years and working very closely with the ETC group in Canada, who has been raising alarms about the discussions and debates around climate geoengineering. And climate geoengineering, as you're probably somewhat familiar, is the idea that we can have some kind of a techno-fix that will either draw down the CO2 out of the atmosphere, or like put mirrors in space or something and reduce the amount of solar energy that reaches the planet. Now, a lot of people think, for example, spewing sulfate particles into the stratosphere has probably got some risks associated. Most of us have a gut reaction that's not a good idea, or that putting a million mirrors in space is probably not going to work. But there are these more benign approaches that are gaining more and more favor because they involve dirt and growing things, and that always seems like a good idea. Soil, dirt, growing things, plants, that always feels much more comfortable than sulfate particles in the stratosphere. So two technologies in particular that are discussed over and over again in the debates around climate geoengineering are biochar and bioenergy with carbon capture and sequestration, which I will refer to just as BECCS, which is the acronym. And Biofuel Watch has done a lot of work looking at more closely at these two technologies and kind of pushing back within the geoengineering discussions about this. People who are enthusiastic about biochar range from farmers, organic farmers who are just wanting to figure out a way to improve their soils, to people who are looking to offset the emissions from tar sands extraction by a massive upscaling of carbon trade credits for biochar. And the main investors so far have been ConocoPhillips, which is very much involved with tar sands. The Gates Foundation and the Carbon War Room are also behind the idea of using biochar for climate geoengineering. The problem with biochar, as Mike has already pointed out, is that first of all, it involves pyrolysis, and pyrolysis is basically a form of incineration that spews out toxins into the atmosphere. Another problem with it is that on any grand scale, it has the same problem as any other biomass-based technology. Huge land footprint. You have to have enough, wood and enough. People will often talk about how there's all this wood waste and waste from forestry and agriculture, and we'll just use that. There's this much waste out there, and that is already, even at the scale we are now, people are cutting trees for bioenergy. So there's not waste out there. That's, it may be the case on some small farms that, you have a pile of waste there you can do something with and you want to know what to do with it. But on a global scale, we don't have that kind of level of waste available that we can bring down CO2 out of the atmosphere by pyrolyzing it. And then the idea is to make charcoal from that. You burn it with low oxygen, you get basically what is an ash and char residue, and you bury that in the soil. It's largely carbon, and the idea is that it'll stay in the soil. The carbon will be sequestered in the soil, and the biochar will help with the yields of crops that are grown in that soil. Does that really work? Well, we reviewed peer-reviewed studies. There's a lot of hype about this, but we went and looked only at peer-reviewed studies. We looked at, I think it was something around 12 different peer-reviewed studies that were in the field. They're not lab studies done with sterile soils in a greenhouse under controlled conditions, because soils don't work that way. Ecosystems don't work that way. That doesn't tell us anything to look at that. I mean, it's maybe useful as an exercise in some cases, but what we really want to know is what happens in the real world with this. If we're going to try to geoengineer the climate, will this actually work? And what we found out is that the results are all over the map, including, in some cases, biochar additions reducing the amount of carbon in the soil. So we have reports on our website. Since I don't have time to go into a whole lot of detail, I direct you to our website at biofuelwatch.net to see the reports where we've reviewed these peer-reviewed studies. And the results on yield, for example, the USDA has done a review where they found that of 50% of the studies that were reported, only about half of them showed a yield increase from biochar use. And that's not to say that half the time it increases the yield and half the time it doesn't, because there's also a reporting bias in the literature that has to be taken into account. So the other problem is that new studies are showing that what determines the stability of carbon in soil is not just what kind of carbon you put in there. It is an ecosystem property that has to do with the environment of the soil, what else is in the soil, the chemical makeup of the soil, the organic carbon base in the soil, and so on. It's not as simple as finding the right kind of carbon and putting it in the soil. The other thing to consider is if we were going to engineer the climate this way, we would have to gather massive amounts of biomass to do that, and that would assume that this actually worked. There was a study published in Nature a couple of years where they claimed that we could draw down 12% of global greenhouse gas emissions using biochar globally. And what that involved was the conversion of 556 million hectares of land to dedicated plantations, gathering most forestry and agriculture residues, using most animal manures from animal production facilities, and so on, pyrolyzing all of that, transporting it all to a facility, pyrolyzing it all, transporting it back out into the field, and then tilling it into the soil or burying it in some manner. So you can see that all of what's involved in doing that probably not going to work. Bioenergy with carbon capture sequestration has the same problems as all other forms of bioenergy. And in addition to that, it has the problems with carbon capture and sequestration added to the top of that. Carbon capture and sequestration is the idea that you can, capture the carbon out of a waste stream, put it in, compress it, put it through pipelines, and bury it in spaces underground. Well, we know that the Earth's surface is not a static entity. It's constantly moving. We have earthquakes, we have plate tectonics, et cetera, et cetera. So the question is, how reliable is it to stick this massive bunches of carbon into spaces underground and assume it's going to stay there? The little experience that we have with it so far is not at all promising. There's examples of it in Alberta where they've done some tests with it, and already those are leaking. There's another example in the North Sea with, I think it's Statoil. Already there's questions about whether that carbon is staying underground where it's been put. And we could easily be, relying on this. And the thing to understand, President Obama in his speech talked about clean coal, and we're going to bury the carbon emissions from coal underground. It'll all be okay. Same thing with bioenergy. You can just hold off until I'm done. So this is, very worrying because, again, bioenergy is still viewed as being this carbon neutral process. New trees will grow and absorb the same amount of carbon. And then, if we can, and now bioenergy with carbon capture sequestration is being billed as a way to be not just carbon neutral, but carbon negative, because we'll take the neutral process and we'll capture the carbon and bury it. And so we'll actually be drawing down carbon out of the atmosphere. And it sounds all very nice, but I just want to end by saying that, and also just to say that, the IPCC and other bodies, President Obama, we keep hearing over and over again about carbon capture and sequestration, and especially bioenergy and carbon capture sequestration. A lot of what's happening with BECCS right now is capture of the CO2 stream from ethanol fermentation in corn refineries that is then being pumped to old oil wells, and the pressure from putting it into the oil wells is enhanced oil recovery, is pushing more oil so they can access more oil. And this is a huge trend, and there's a lot of money and support behind this. We can, instead of drilling new wells, we'll be able to just get more out of some of the old wells that have become unproductive at this point by using captured carbon. I just want to end by saying, there's one thing that's almost worse than capitalism in general. It's capitalism that's based on profiting from very bad ideas like bioenergy and biochar and so on and so forth, and many of the other technologies that are being proposed as solutions to the climate problem. And just finally, too, to say that, I've come increasingly aware of the fact that our obsession with carbon is creating problems for us, because we're so singularly focused on this issue of counting carbon molecules in and out of the atmosphere that we've really lost sight of very basic common sense things that we know and we knew had to happen 50 years ago, that we still haven't taken major steps to make happen, some of which Mike has already touched on. Thank you so much.
Right. So I think we already have a lot to chew on and think about. Been given a lot of food for thought. I just wanted to broaden things out a little bit and talk about the way in which capitalism operates by looking at the energy system. I also want to look at Germany, because a lot of people cite Germany as a possible way forward, and ask the question whether that's really replicable in other countries, and to what extent it is an actual solution based on some of the things we're hearing about renewable energy from Mike and Rachel. And just to briefly introduce myself, I'm a teacher and activist. Mostly over the last couple of years, I've been involved in the campaign to get Indian Point nuclear plant shut down, which is 30 miles from New York City, 40 years old, and they want to relicense it for another 20 years, so we could have a 60-year-old nuclear plant that's already had lots of accidents and leaks 30 miles away from a major population center. As part of that, I went to and wrote from Fukushima in 2011 and 2012 about the nuclear disaster there, because so many people, James Hansen amongst them most prominently, are so for nuclear power when it is so disastrous in human and economic terms. So, more recently, I'm involved in the new coalition, System Change, Not Climate Change, which involves a number of different socialist groups, as well as the Green Party and various other organizations, trying to look at not just environmental questions, but social questions and the connection to those things. Because I don't think we're going to get any genuine ecological justice without some social justice. And the two things are inextricably intertwined. And so that's why we need to work on both things at once, because there are clear issues of race and gender and class mixed in with every single environmental question that you want to think about. And from the other end of the spectrum, in terms of jobs and the economy, you can't really talk about any issue now in terms of housing, transit, or anything else if you're not also talking about environmental questions and questions of ecology. And in fact, the word environment is really much more of a capitalist term anyway, because it kind of posits the idea that outside of us somewhere the environment exists and then we are separate from it. So many people prefer the word ecology or ecological because of the way in which it promotes the idea that we're embedded within the biosphere and as much part of it as anything else. And I wrote a book in 2010 called Ecology and Socialism, which I have a few copies of here, which I wrote on the basis of wanting to, looking at lots of other books on environmental questions, whereby you read 90% or more of the book and it's all about how disastrous the situation is, and then the solutions at the end, in the last 10 pages, if you're lucky, are completely inadequate and rather absurd oftentimes when they've just laid out the scale of the problem. And so I wanted to write a book that was more half and half. A critique, but then also about solutions. Solutions for right now, but also solutions for an alternative society, a society that would be genuinely socially just and ecologically sustainable, one that is not capitalist by definition. Because I don't think we can, if we want to save the planet and ourselves by extension, we actually cannot save capitalism. We have to choose. And I'd far rather choose a different society, one that is genuinely one that we can live in with each other and not recognize each other. We have relationships between things, and capitalism encourages us to do that, commodify everything. And now that commodification is extending to the atmosphere, to all manner of other things. But what does it actually mean to be human, and how would we define that? What would we define as a good quality of life? I don't think we would define it as buying the latest stuff, as we are constantly encouraged to do, because one of the dynamics of capitalism is, of course, a commitment to growth and a commitment to creating more things that we have to go and buy, and convincing us through advertising. The advertising budget in the US alone is $1 trillion a year. That is twice what is spent on all education, public and private, from kindergarten through graduate school. Think about what a waste, a total waste of resources that is. And we don't actually need that at all. Think about the $1 trillion spent on the military. The US military is by far the largest polluter on the planet, not just in terms of killing people, but in toxic releases. It produces more toxic release than the 5 largest chemical companies in the world combined. It generates more CO2 in a day than all bar 35 countries. So just getting rid of the US military would be a pretty significant step along the road to along the road to some kind of sane world. And of course, if you look at how much energy the US government uses, 80% of the energy used by the federal government goes directly to the Department of Defense. 80% of its energy use. And of course, then you're talking about water and all kinds of other things, and the wars that need to be started and propagated in order to continue with world domination, which the US is obviously committed to. So that's kind of by way of introduction, and just to quote Shirley Chisholm, who's the first elected black congresswoman for New York's 12th district. She served 7 terms. In her autobiography, she said this: "It will do black Americans absolutely no good to be politically and economically enfranchised into a system that systematically denies human values and destroys the environment that sustains life. By affirming and fighting for the values that are life-sustaining, black politicians can become the vanguard of the forces that save this country, if it is to be saved." And I think that that quote, obviously with a black president, first black president in power, who has started to talk about environmental questions after a several-year hiatus, it could not be more apposite in terms of this obviously applies not just to him, but the whole, everybody. And I think that's why we also have to talk about not just environmental questions separated off, but connected to social questions too, because I think this is really, as has been said by Mike, we actually know what the answers are, right? And we have the technology currently available to carry those answers, carry out those solutions, real solutions, not false solutions that have been run through. The problem is not that we don't know what to do or how to do it. The problem is a social and a political one, entirely a social and political one. That's not to say we couldn't benefit from more research and so on and so forth, but really now we know how to make a transition to a sustainable world. What's holding us back is the system itself. And that's why ultimately I think we need to get rid of it. Because as a materialist and a Marxist, I know something that the capitalists seem to be completely unaware of, that we cannot live without a planet, without the biodiversity, the complexity, the sheer beauty, the intricate interconnections between all different species and the non-living world that we're a part of. And despite the environmental degradation that has been well catalogued by many scientists around the world, and the looming threat of climate change, which we're already currently living through, it doesn't seem to make any difference. And I'm going to quote some statistics on why that is. Because, as Rachel was saying, basically, the only problem that capitalism actually recognizes is when they can't make enough money. Right? If they're not accumulating profitability and making a profit, that's really the only thing that forces them to change, along with the associated kind of geopolitical power questions. They don't really care about anything else. That's the rationale for this system. And so that explains why, for example, there are 14,000 new food products produced on the shelves in US grocery stores every single year, as if we need any of those 14,000 new things, which is kind of an amazing statistic in and of itself. But just one illustration of this kind of idea of technological optimism. It's not just in terms of putting things in space, but it's also on the ground. So Bill, I was reading the latest issue of Wired the other day for some unknown reason, and Bill Wesick, the cover article, he says, kind of breathlessly, quote, "When the objects around us can talk to one another, the elements of our physical universe will converge and spring to life. In time, this network will grow to fulfill our needs, understand our desires, and enable our dreams. Welcome to the programmable world. It's closer than you think." Now, we could dismiss this kind of techno-fantasy stuff as fantasy and silly if it wasn't at the same time taken so seriously. So at this October's South by Southwest Eco Conference, there's a session entitled 3D Printing, the Answer to Global Food Scarcity, where it states, I'm not even making this up, it states, 3D printing offers the promise of revolutionary change in manufacturing and supply chain management. We pose the question, is it also the futurist solution to global food scarcity? This path-breaking technology, now available at your local Staples, holds the potential of nutrient-rich food that can be produced locally and on demand. Is there a solution here that meets global food requirements without the strain on natural resources generated by the Green Revolution, and one that bypasses the privatization of food chains? Amazing, right? It's going to solve all our problems. And then on an even larger scale, for several years, the Chinese government has been investing hundreds of millions of dollars into something that they call the Internet of Things-based manufacturing. This began with former Chinese Premier Wen Jiabao put forward the equation, Internet plus Internet of Things equals wisdom of the earth.
Yeah.
And of course, we just witnessed August 5th, the manufacture and eating on live internet feed of the world's first lab-grown burger, built from cow stem cells, funded by Google billionaire Sergey Brin, who said that he was doing it for animal welfare reasons. It's been applauded by animal welfare rights people, even though actually to keep this thing going, you have to feed it constantly with the blood of dead cows collected from slaughterhouses. And it's the most energy-intensive, water-intensive way of actually in modern technique in modern biology. But anyway, it also cost $380,000 to produce. So in a few years, no doubt, we'll be offered Google burgers to eat, and this will be the solution to world food crisis. So, but I think that there's the associated question, not just the question of profitability, but the competition between nation states to grab more power and wealth and prestige, which, i.e. imperialism on the international stage, competition between countries means, explains why it's actually impossible for them to come up with an international agreement that effectively addresses climate change. That's why they've been negotiating for almost 2 decades and gone nowhere. In fact, they've gone backwards from George H.W. Bush in 1992 quite significantly. Just to illustrate that point, despite whatever's going on, the late Donald Troutline, ex-CEO of Bethlehem Steel, has a quote where he says, I'm not in the business of manufacturing steel, I'm in the business of manufacturing money. And that's really the purpose of the whole system. So based on competition, expansion, and profitability. Germany's kind of interesting, and I'm going to talk about how many people know the situation with what Germany has managed to do with regard to feed-in tariffs. A little bit, not very much. Well, on the one hand, Germany is the 4th largest economy in the world, right? And it has managed to now be powered 25% by wind and solar. And of course, we know that they are phasing out their nuclear power, which previously accounted for 30% of the energy in Germany, by 2022. And their aim is to replace that with genuine renewables. Even though they do biofuels, the focus is on wind and solar. And some of the facts are pretty interesting because Germany is generating so much electricity now that it often is able to export it to other countries in Europe that can no longer produce for themselves. Primarily, the poster child for the nuclear energy situation is, of course, France. But France cannot generate enough of its own electricity anymore. Why not? Because the rivers that are used to cool the nuclear plants are often either too low, too hot, or both. And they have to operate at reduced capacity. And so the idea that nuclear energy is an answer to climate change is completely false for all kinds of different reasons. That is only one of them. But it does show that Germany, as a result of government regulation, changes to laws, can force through a pretty significant move towards renewable energy. And they've invested, billions of dollars at this point in the solar and wind sector through adopting this feed-in tariff where if you generate electricity as an individual or a community, generate electricity by wind or solar, you get paid 4 times the market rate for 20 years by the utility companies. They have to buy it. They also have to buy it from you. That's the law in Germany. And so this has led to a massive explosion of not just utilities building solar and wind panels, turbines, but individuals doing it too. So Bavarian farmers with their large barn roofs and fields are the biggest customer group for photovoltaics in the world. 2/3 of solar panels are owned by individuals. More than half the giant wind turbines that have sprouted up all over Germany have been commissioned not by energy corporations but by individuals and community groups. More than 1 million households and individuals are their own energy producers in Germany. And there are over 130 bioenergy villages across the country which are aiming to produce their heat power from local sources. Once they get substantial storage technologies and they come online, which is soon to happen really, their objective is to have them as be the nucleus of essentially autonomous energy islands. And the German government has streamlined the permitting process for all of these things. So like in New York, for example, you have to fill out loads of forms. It takes over 2 years to get your solar panels, if that's what you're trying to buy. In Germany, you can do that in less than a week from beginning to end, and they're installed on your house. And Germany is now building a new DC transmission network for $25 billion. They just authorized that to make sure that they can transport the energy around, because obviously during the nighttime is when actually the wind is more consistent and higher, so wind turbines tend to generate there, and obviously solar power generates in the sun, so they are in fact compatible in terms of building them together, but a lot of them are in northern Germany and the consumers are in the south, so they need to build things and then export them. So this is the direction that Germany has gone on but I think you also have to look at some of the historical reasons for this change. So for example, Germany has already lost essentially 2 wars over the question of inability to access oil in particular. Lord Curzon, the Secretary of the Navy, British Secretary of the Navy, commenting on the First World War, said that Britain had floated to victory on a sea of oil. You can't really explain the invasion of Russia nor the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor without talking about access to oil. And so they've learned some things. And of course, the Green Party and the Green Movement in Germany is much more connected to the unions, is much more powerful. So and Germany is an export-led economy. So a lot of this they can now export, and they are. And so for lots of historical economic reasons, the German ruling class, the elite, their interests have actually coincided with the interests of ordinary people, particularly after the experience of Chernobyl, when a lot of this started by ordinary Germans against nuclear power and against the big energy corporations. Coincided against sectional interests tied to fossil fuel production and nuclear power to disadvantage them and advantage alternatives. The question really is that replicable by other countries, and to what extent is Germany really moving away from a paradigm of growth and fossil fuel use? The answer is no to both questions. Germany, as part of the G8, still lobbies for and is very keen on the expansion of oil production because they're still using just as much, in fact more, oil, gasoline and diesel, and their economy is still expanding. So, and for various other reasons, we could talk about why the US has obviously gone in completely the other direction. How do we help? How do we explain that? I guess I should kind of wrap up more or less there, other than to say that many different reports from the US government, from Citibank, from various places, posit that, or state that global energy oil production is 93 million barrels a day at the moment. By 2020, it's going to go up to 2025, it's going to go up to 110 million barrels. Gas production is going up. Actually, last year, according to the Energy Information Agency, the US added a record amount of barrels of oil and natural gas to its inventory of reserves, and that's entirely down to fracking for oil and for gas. And in fact, fracking is coming to Wisconsin. People may or may not know, not in terms of the wells, but they need sand. They need lots of sand. And sand is something that's been mined in Wisconsin for a long time. And so there are lots of other statistics on that. The International Energy Agency, which is part of the US government, it's a Paris-based agency. They said new fossil fuel extraction and processing will total an estimated $22.87 trillion between 2012 and 2035, while investment in renewables, and they include hydropower, biomass, and nuclear in their renewables category, will only amount to 7.32 trillion. So they're going to spend 22.87 trillion between now and 2035 on more production of oil and gas, and only 7.32 trillion on renewables, the vast majority of which are not renewable, and we don't agree with. So we're going in completely the wrong direction. And if anybody read Obama's statement on the Arctic, released in May, they are encouraging a massive expansion of oil and gas production and military facilities in the Arctic to make sure that they don't get outcompeted by Russia and other countries that want the 25% of oil reserves that are there in the Arctic. To quote National Security Advisor Tom Donilon, America's new energy posture allows us to engage the world from a position of greater strength. Increasing U.S. energy supplies act as a cushion that helps reduce our vulnerability to global supply disruptions and affords us a stronger hand in pursuing and implementing our international security goals. So there you have it. And so I think that helps to explain why there's really been no difference between George W. Bush's energy policies and the policies of Obama. This is not anything to do with Democrats and Republicans. It's about the direction of the US state that is completely tied to capitalism. And so as long as we have capitalism, there are no real solutions. Ultimately, I think we have to fight for the kind of things that Mike outlined, which means, because if you look at it historically from 1850, when they switched to coal, the first kind of carbon revolution, from biomass, wood and so on, wood use did not go down. It continued to go up. When they switched again from coal to oil around the First World War, coal production did not go down. It went up. So all production, more energy just leads to more energy. And so what you see now is that renewables are not replacing oil and coal and so on. They're just an adjunct to it. So oil energy use is just continuing to go up, including dirty energy, even if we add these tiny little segments of renewable, much of which is not, in fact, renewable. So it's really a question of social power. That's what we need to get back to, and rearranging the equation, because we've lost so much social power over the last 30 years under neoliberalism. And I think you can see what's encouraging is over the last 2 years, certainly since the Arab Spring in 2011, I think we've entered a new era of revolt, rebellion, and revolution. And obviously, Madison was the epicenter of some of that, and I came here with my union. It was an unbelievable experience, really, to be in a town in the United States that was so based around community and cooperation and all the signs in the stores and all that. Obviously, we lost for reasons that we could talk about. But it was an amazing, transformative experience, and I'm sure people are transformed here. So I think that is really the kind of question that we need to get back to. And while there are some technical questions that we need to talk about, and what is a solution from what is not, it's really a question. We're not going to get anything that we want without rearranging social power and taking some back for our side and putting limits on the power of the corporations and the politicians who facilitate their operation, and ultimately getting rid of corporations and thinking about how we could live in a completely different world. Thanks very much.
So before we open up to Q&A, I just want to respond to a few of the things that I heard that I didn't know I was going to hear. So first on Chris's point about what is replacing things or not. the actual trends in recent years, and you saw it in the earlier chart that Rachel had, is that energy production, electricity production in the U.S. actually peaked a couple of years ago. It's largely a function of the economy, which is going to continue to be in a downward spiral, so this is not a temporary trend. But coal production is what's leading that decline right there. Coal and oil have been decreasing and are being replaced in the U.S. by natural gas, biomass, and wind, and tiny, insignificant amounts of solar. But some of the things that Rachel pointed out on, I think we're coming from this Green Illusions book, and I'm not sure I want to read it anymore, but there are some things that are myths. She convinced me earlier I should read this, and now I'm like, oh, I don't know, so I know that's not true.
So attack your co-panelists in the audience, Mike.
Sorry. So on the solar thing, there are a lot of toxics in solar, but there are also a lot of ways of making solar. Some of them are far more toxic than others. I think she probably brought out the examples of the most toxic kinds that are not generally used anymore. Not that the newer ones are non-toxic, but there are a lot of different options out there. There are even organic ones that are being developed that won't have a lot of those toxic problems. They'll be like plant-based kind of materials, which might have their own problems. They might be biotech for all I know, but nonetheless, the toxic reputation of solar does not apply across the board. The intermittency thing, it's not true that wind needs fossil fuels to back them up. That is a myth. Yes, wind and solar are intermittent, and that argument gets used against them all the time, but just saw a headline from yesterday that in the UK, they're paying, I think it's 30 million pounds a year to pay wind farms to stop producing because they can't use that power. Why can't they use that power? It's because they have too much base load, as Germany has found out. They have too many nuclear reactors that can't just shut down when wind is available. And the problem is the base load, not the intermittency. And there was a report that came out from December from the University of Delaware that showed that wind, solar, and energy storage within the PJM grid, which is a large section of the mid-Atlantic and it reaches out pretty far west and south now, but it's basically Pennsylvania, Jersey, Maryland, DC, Delaware is the core of that grid. 99% of that wind, solar, and energy storage can meet all the electricity needs with 99.9% reliability and can do so affordably. That's what the study said. And so that's totally intermittent stuff, but you need energy storage to deal with intermittency once you get to the point where we have enough wind and solar that we have to worry about it, and we're not there yet. And as Chris pointed out, they complement each other with wind and solar in terms of time of day. So that's a real big benefit. My definition of what clean energy is something that stops polluting once you make it. So yes, there's a lot of concrete and other materials that go into building any of these things we're talking about, including the wind turbines. But with wind and solar, they don't have to keep polluting per kilowatt hour like anything with a smokestack does or like nuclear power does. So that's where I draw the line. And finally, on solar, yeah, because of the toxics in it, because it's generally more expensive, but that's actually changing. We're seeing places where, like in North Carolina, Duke Energy just testified last year before the Public Utility Commission, that's cheaper to build new solar than to build new coal in North Carolina. So we're starting to see the point where these lines cross, where the dirty things are becoming too expensive and the clean things, or cleaner things, are getting to the point where they're actually competitive with the fossil fuels that we're used to. So it's not so true that solar photovoltaic is not viable anymore. However, I would still urge folks, if you're talking about homes, to go after solar hot water first. Yeah. Because it's a lot cheaper, it's lower tech, doesn't have the toxins, and it's the only way to get off of burnable fuels for heating in homes, whereas with electricity you can buy non-burn wind credits and things off the grid, but you can't buy non-burn heating fuels unless you're doing something on site. So solar hot water is the way to do that, and I would prioritize some brief space for that use. So yeah, let's do questions.
Back you up on that. I've had a solar hot water heater on my roof 35 years. And it never failed me and has maintained quality for all that time. So that's a good supplement to help reduce your energy needs.
I'd like to add to your wind not being intermittent. By proper placement of wind turbines, you can make sure that if you have 3 different wind turbines, the efficiency is about 33%. If you site them in different places, then there is wind at one of the places
Yeah.
For instance, in Texas, if you put them on the coast, you have wind in the morning. If you put some in Del Rio, then you have wind in the afternoon. If you put them in West Texas, then you have wind at night. So it's much better baseload than nuclear. And like you say, in France, they have to back the nuclear out because Germany's solar comes on so much in the middle of the day, and it's really wrecking France's nuclear, giving France a real nuclear problem with their nuclear reactors.
So,
Great problem to have.
other comments and questions?
Well, there's a lot
Disagreements?
of
Well, hang on.
technology on the wind turbines, the new designs. The egg beater design is proven that it's viable in cities. You can mount it on the top of buildings and doesn't take up that much room. It's quiet and works as well as any other design or better.
Yeah, I just wanted to make a comment. I came across some students a while back that developed this biodegradable wood solar panel with film that's biodegradable. So I'm not saying that, Rachel, your comments aren't apropos or useful or whatever, but I am hopeful that there are technological innovations that will be coming along as if we can stay alive long enough, that will help rectify some of these issues. Because, and my other thought is, are we going to discuss here ways to organize around forcing the state to face up to what we want, or no, that's not the proper workshop?
In our last 12 minutes, we could take it there if you want, or do lunch later and
I
talk
don't know
about
if
it
this
for
is
a
the right
longer time.
workshop for that, but.
Yeah.
I think if you come this afternoon from 2 to 4, that's where we're going to address this.
Yeah, that'd be
Okay,
good.
Yeah.
I got that marked.
Go ahead.
Yeah, I was going to go there too. I'll just throw out the question. Yeah, I am interested in hearing some of the changes in the social structure, the capitalist structure. You've laid out the framework, but some of the specifics, how we do it, what the steps are, that might practically work. So again, if you have time now, but if not, later.
Okay. I'd like Chris to answer, but let me first quickly say public power is a key part of the solution, and there's increasing movement in this country in certain local governments. I think San Francisco just finally pulled it off to municipalize the power grids locally.
Yeah, I think that, I agree. I think that's a huge step because obviously if you have privatized, and many countries now have privatized what used to be held by the public, right? If you've privatized the energy system, then what is the objective of the utilities? Obviously to sell you more, right? That's how they make money. There's no incentive really to use less. And so one of the things we need to do is bring back into the public realm the municipalize the energy production system, so that the other thing that the utilities will not do is invest in maintenance. So they are always cutting down on their maintenance costs because that cuts into their profitability. And so that helps to explain why there's no real innovation in the American grid, which is actually three pretty separate grids, and why 1 in 3 Americans in any given year suffers a blackout at some point, because there's no real incentive from the private corporations to really upgrade their systems in any meaningful way. So putting it back into seeing it as a service as opposed to a commodity gives a completely different incentive to the production of electricity, and it also underlines the right that it should be a right, that people should not be paying for something that you need to have, and I think electricity is in the same category in terms of staying alive as food and water when you think about trying to stay warm in winter or trying to not die of heat exhaustion in summers, which are being exacerbated by climate change. So.
I'd like to follow up on my earlier question about the biomass. I have felt that, and it relates to the municipalization, I have felt that small power plants in a distributed energy system, such as in Wisconsin, where we have a lot of agriculture and forests, that village-based or town-based small systems that can collect from, say, 30-mile radius from farms and woodlots or the national forest in the north would be a viable way of producing some significant percentage of the energy to achieve sort of an energy self-reliance, coupled with wind and solar and pedestrian scale and other issues. But you're telling me that burning a tree is poison. The idea of chipping wood residue and putting it into a boiler, is that ash, you're saying it cannot be used as a fertilizer, that it's poison?
If you look at the, and I have, actually I ran out of copies of this fact sheet already, but go on our website, energyjustice.net/fact sheets, and click on the woody biomass incineration fact sheet. That's my latest research that's going to come out in a report later this year. Some of the research coming out of Europe actually shows that wood ash, like straight from a forest, has so many metals in it that some European countries, if they apply the same standards that they do to ash of other sorts, it would be regulated as hazardous waste. These metals get in there partially because of coal burning and because of the other industrial pollution that is sucked up by trees, and then trees are sequestering it, I guess you can say. And then when we burn those trees, we release mercury and these other toxins back into the air. And so there's radioactivity in them, there are metals in them, there are all kinds of pollutants that trees have absorbed that are going to be in the ash and being put back into the air. It's common sense.
You would say the same for agricultural residue, but probably not as much because it's an annual
You're going to
project.
run into some of the same of that, yes. And by agricultural residue, you can't save the climate by burning trees. I mean, it's just counterintuitive to even common sense.
No, I'm not talking about burning trees, I'm talking about,
or
like,
even crops.
forestry,
These things,
there's a lot of slash that's left.
right, and that slash that's left needs to stay in the forest. And the
Some of
latest
it.
science also shows, all of it needs to stay in there because it
Some of
creates.
it needs to be taken out or it calls forest fires.
That's also a
Too
myth.
much.
I've worked
Can
on
I
forest
answer you,
plans.
please?
I've
Let me
worked on
answer.
forest plans, and I've walked through forests, national forests, where the slash is so outrageous.
Nature does
Look
not
at
create
places-
waste.
Pardon?
Nature does not create waste. The waste
No, I'm
slash
not saying
stuff that's
nature
left in
does.
the
The
forest.
foresters do.
Let me finish.
Yeah.
The waste that is left in forest creates habitats for small mammals that if you take that out, they don't have that habitat anymore. If you look at the science on that, I can send you the studies,
And
that's
listen,
what they're saying.
I'm familiar with that.
And
You're not maybe imagining the scale of slash that is in some of the forests in this country, where people will go into the mountains and they'll take the saw timber and they leave just an incredible mess.
Yes, and that's a problem, and we need to stop that mess
That's
from
the
happening.
slash
not
I'm
take that
talking
stuff
about.
up and
That is
see
not
this
a
field.
habitat.
Can I just interject?
Sorry, go ahead.
I mean, one of the problems with that, there's a lot of the nutrients are in the slash, and there's various other things, and Mike has touched on some of them, but there is a lot of slash, and I have been in forests that the problem is if you set up a facility that's going to burn for the next 50 years, 650,000 tons of wood every year, those slash piles are going to be gone in the first 6 months, and you need an ongoing continuous supply that's within an easy distance of your facility. You're going to run out of slash very quickly.
That's why
So
I'm
that's-
talking village scale. I'm not talking doing these big things
Even
that
on
are
the
gonna
village
suck
scale,
from all over the place.
those things, they burn, they're so inefficient. Most of them burn at like 30% efficiency rate.
Yeah, but if you set them up cogeneration, you can get up 70, 80%.
You
You
can
can get
improve
higher
the efficiency.
efficiency, but you still are releasing more carbon than you get from coal. You're still creating other pollutants in the course of it. And the smaller scale means that you're not going to be subject to the regulations that, if it were a larger burner, would actually protect the air quality
Yeah,
more.
the smaller,
Now,
the
pollution
dirtier.
per amount of energy you get is actually much higher if you're using a lot of smaller burners. And on ag waste, those nutrients need to go back into soils because we're robbing our soils by
That's
not
the ash.
putting them
The
back.
ash would be returned.
The ash returns some things, but a lot
If
of
we
this stuff needs to go back in.
Go to other
Let's go to other
questions.
Yeah.
questions.
Go ahead.
Well, I thought I read a few years ago that Denmark was probably a country that was moving the fastest towards self-renewable energy. What do you know anything about their program?
Yeah, I can talk a little bit about that. Go ahead. Did you have a question?
Could you mention biodigesters, manure?
Sure. Digesters are basically composting within a vessel. And so it's actually better to do aerobic composting. It's more energy efficient even to do that. You can use the latent heat off of that, and it doesn't it makes some of the nutrients not as leachable by doing that. So composting is actually better than digestion, but anaerobic digestion, which is without oxygen in a vessel, you can get the methane generated off of that, and they use this a lot on sewage sludge at sewage treatment plants. They can use it on food waste, and they use it in factory farms. Most of the digesters out there are used on, when we're talking about animal waste, on factory farm scales, and a lot of the subsidies as renewable energy go to support types of agriculture that should not be supported and not have that in competition with wind. So we're not opposed to digesters altogether. We think it could be an appropriate waste management solution for farms, but recognize that the subsidies as renewable energy should not flow to them.
And there's over 1 million small-scale digesters in China, for example, well over 1 million. So, you know, and it's been there a long time, because that's how they get rid of their waste from their animals that they have in the backyard. So, and generate heat from it.
Here, then.
Is there any place where some group or people have put together how we get from where we are now to a better place? I mean, you're saying all the things that don't work, and you're saying, you know, some do, but the ones that do are, you know, very small. But and that we have to, you know, topple capitalism. But I mean, is there anything that says, you know, there are steps that and I'm talking about not just that you had, you know, these are the things, but you're you know, is there a plan? I mean, is there something that, rather than all these things like this, is there some, you know, kind of stuff, these are, yeah.
There's no silver bullet, but there are a lot of policies that enumerate these sorts of things that are already out there.
But from the policies to actually to a steps, you know, we know we have coal, and we're using coal, that you can say practical steps that you want. And I have not heard any mention of conservation, you know, stopping the use of energy. But I mean, a kind of a
blueprint.
Blueprint, right? That we're going to. It's a long fight. What are the? And these are great. These are the perfect policy. But as we work towards those, what are the best things to be doing now? You know, we've got an idea. You want to tackle this one thing, but is there a kind of a guideline?
Well, I just want to make a sort of general comment, which is that, you know, people often say, so what do we do? And then they're looking for some kind of a technology or some kind of a something to do that is different. And I like to say embrace no. Because a lot of what we need to do is to say no to a lot of the things that are happening, and then we can start working on, you know, what else to do. But we need to stop a lot of these extremely destructive technologies and approaches that are happening, and we're all very busy doing that. And but also recognizing that we don't need to like do a whole bunch more research and in technology development and so on. We have these solutions. We know for years that we need to shift our agriculture to small scale, organic, et cetera, et cetera. We just haven't done that. So the main thing we need to do, for example, in the realm of agriculture, is to say no to industrial forms of agriculture and recognize that just doing that is...
Hang on,
if you're doing political, you need to then say, what yes can you say when you're saying no on that
I
kind of
have
thing?
something to
Yes.
answer a question I thought I would throw out there.
We'll take somebody who hasn't
Okay,
spoken yet,
sorry.
and then you, yeah. Yes, go ahead.
Oh, you're saying, you know, what do we do? Well, I think coalitions and things like system change, not climate change, that Chris is involved in, things like that, we have to organize in order to be able to do anything. I mean, it's one thing if I stand out in my backyard and say no, you know, it's not going to go anywhere. So that, you know, what we have is power in numbers, and there are good and bad ideas. There are ideas that are not yet fleshed out, and it's good that we're talking to each other, and that's, you know, an important step. But we really need to organize to go up against the kinds of things that are, you know, the corporations, the interests that are putting profit before, you know, before people. And the only way, the very first thing that you know, is to reach out to other people and to start, you know, forming these coalitions. And some of the things that you guys have done, especially on the East Coast, you know, and you know, that's really what we need to do, is to get active and to organize with each other in coalitions and other groups. you know, to try to force these things.
I guess take like maybe 4 more comments and then maybe make a couple of minutes of concluding remarks or so. The woman at the back.
So I think this whole conference is about that. So I'm speaking directly to this woman in the front who's asking what to do. That's why everyone came here. And these amazing workshops have featured many different ideas, from all Paravitz's worker co-ops and how that could be organized, to the get the money out of elections as one of the very first things that we need to do, so we can elect people who can put these kind of solutions into practice. You know, it takes a while to like digest so much of the information that we've been given over the last few days. A little bit more to come as well, and put it all together. There isn't anyone that has one answer to that, but everybody has been putting their angle on what exactly needs to be done. So we just can't sit and wait for someone to tell us what the next thing is to do. You have to look at the stuff that you've been taught during this whole conference and say, okay, where can those pieces fit in together? What is the thing that I think needs to be done first? And work on that. And be assured that all the rest of the people here are working on their angle of it. Look what these people have put together for us for energy. You know, the same people are doing the move to amend. The same people are doing, you know, getting the money out of elections. You decide what you think the first thing is that needs to be done and start there. Everything else is connected to it.
Just in the back.
He has
There's a
had his
hand
hand up.
Oh, sorry, go ahead. Go ahead.
Okay. The solution to the problem is in the problem itself. We don't recognize it because all you see is the problem. When you look at things like human waste, sewage, all you see is sewage. But the solution is built in. All you have to do is break that down in its basic components, which is methane gas, which we use as fuel, and the solid material, which is basically high-grade fertilizer. And don't shake your head, because there's a company just east of here in Milwaukee that's actually developing high-grade fertilizer called Milorganite.
I know all about
And we
that.
see that quite often in Eagle River. And that's an area where it's very nutrient-poor soil, which has a market for it. And the idea is to develop the markets for these types of materials, and yes, we do have enough methane gas in our sewage to run our cars indefinitely. It's just a matter of getting it on the market and mass production so people can actually do it.
We need to wrap up, unfortunately. I know there's some people who wanted to speak, but maybe we can do that afterwards or at the organizing meeting between 2 and 4. Just on the question of what we can do, obviously that's the main question, right? Because everything is going in the wrong direction, despite a few little things here and there that we can point to as examples of what could be done on a much bigger scale. Really, everything is going in the wrong direction. As I said, I think what's hopeful is that there are more and more people waking up to that fact, whether that's in Egypt. I mean, look at the explosion of protests in Turkey. It started off as an environmental struggle where they didn't, a small group of people did not want a square in Turkey to have the trees ripped out of it and turned into a mall. That exploded over the course of a few days into a massive movement that called into question the entire Turkish state and the basis on which it was operating. Look at the struggles in Brazil, which started out over the question of the World Cup and how much money they were spending on that, but turned into a protest about public transit. And why were they not spending more on public transit? And why were they not spending more on healthcare and education? And the slogan became, we want a World Cup quality healthcare and education system and transit system. And so the cuts that were going to be imposed on the transit system and the fare hikes were all revoked by the government because millions of people took to the streets. And of course, we had an example, as I mentioned, right here in Madison that was inspired by what went on in the Middle East. And Occupy, which I was involved with for over a year. So Occupy completely changed the conversation nationally from one, if you remember back to 2011 and August, when they were talking about the debt ceiling and all kinds of nonsense that ordinary people have no connection to. Within a few weeks, 70 people gather in New York City, and it explodes into a national and international movement. And then it was suddenly the 1% versus the 99%. And they got bailed out, we got sold out. And so that immediately puts it on terms that we can relate to, and nothing practical has actually come out of that yet. And I would say that's because there is no solution that comes through the Democratic Party. We have to, one of the things that we have to do in practical terms is build a genuine third party. To the left.
Second party.
Yes, an actual political group that is based not just on the next election cycle, but is based on the ground in communities, that sees political activism and organization as important as what goes on in Congress. And there's lots of signs that that kind of thing is happening. As has been quoted before, more people under 30 think socialism is better than capitalism, because they know what capitalism is, and that's terrible, whatever they think socialism might be. And so there's lots of bases on things with which to work, and including, for example, municipalizing energy production and reintegrating, I mean, the larger question of how do we reintegrate animals with plants with humans, all of which occur in totally separate areas, all of which produce waste that is then used to go and do some of the crazy things and schemes that they have. Whereas we know that animal waste is the best fertilizer, and why is it being collected in massive toxic lagoons after the animals have been pumped full of antibiotics and pesticides and so on and so forth? There's lots of different ways of going about solving the problem. The question is, as was stated earlier, is we have to organize and fight for it, because it's a question of justice. It's a question of social struggle and power. And we have to win some back at the expense of them, right? And we're going to have to do it independent of the Democratic Party.
Chris.
So,
Can I just wrap up on one?
we have
I
another
know.
panel
Just give
coming
me
in
like
here.
30 seconds.
30 seconds.
So
Wait,
on,
everybody just a second.
on the Milorganite thing, so just Google toxic sludge is good for you, is not good for you. You'll find out plenty on why. But on the saying no thing, as Rachel pointed out, this is a chart we made of how many dirty energy and waste facilities have been proposed over the past few decades versus how many were actually built. 50 to 90% of each of the waves of dirty energy and waste facilities they tried to build have been crushed one community at a time by good grassroots organizing. So this saying no is a key part of making sure we can say yes to the clean alternatives by stopping all these barriers.